Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Meagan Strout, and I am the CEO of Tack Advisors. We'll wait a few minutes and do some introductions in the meantime before we get started so that everybody has an opportunity to join us. But in the meantime, allow me to introduce to you my co-host today, Gianna Gaudini. She is the author of The Art of Event Planning, and she actually was with us almost 2 years ago to the day, right after you had released your book. And now you're with us again 2 years later because you recently came out with this amazing events course online that's self-guided called the $1 Million Event Career, which is so amazing. And I can't wait to talk about it today, but really focus in on one very specific area of your training, which is on contract negotiations, which I feel like is the ugly stepchild nobody ever wants to talk about, but it's like arguably one of the most important pieces of event planning or even business in general, because it's a way for you to really make a mark, save your company a ton of money, and show yourself as a true strategic business partner. So thank you so much for joining us today and to talk with us about this subject.
Of course, I'm so happy to be here. I love Tack Advisors and your community. So, and I'm such a nerd. I love contract negotiations. So it's so fun to get to spend an hour chatting with your community about it.
Yeah, and you're like really in the trenches because right now you are the head of events for Airtable, is that right?
Yes.
So
that's right.
On average, like how many events are you planning per year?
So I am entering my month 6 at Airtable, and I'm in such a unique position in that Airtable has never produced a public B2B event until I joined the company. And so we're really building our events portfolio from the ground up. So there was 0 calendar when I joined. So I can't really say how many events we do on an annual basis because until I joined, there were 0. So we're now building out our portfolio. So we now have a field marketing team that has been spun up after I joined the company. So they're doing more regular, smaller events. In terms of the strategic events that I plan. Those are our really big corporate events that are very highly visible and take a lot of cross-functional support. So with those, we're really focusing on fewer, more marquee moments throughout the year and still evolving. So still planning next year. So it's a really exhilarating time.
And in your previous careers and previous jobs, you've done events that were large citywide events, and you've also done really small bespoke events. And I think no matter what size of the event or where it's located, I think it really kind of all starts with the contract. Would you agree?
There's no events without contracts. That is for sure. And let me tell you, setting yourself up with a really great contract can definitely make or break you in certain scenarios. I have plenty of war stories to share, and I will make sure to share some of those because I think those kind of make hotel contract negotiations more interesting and less dry. So,
yeah. So from your perspective, why is it important and valuable for an administrative business partner, chief of staff to like truly understand how a contract is set and like the different terms and pieces of a contract? Because I think you pretty early on in your career got pretty lucky and had somebody sort of take you under their wing and really teach you and walk you through step by step on how a contract is made. Is that right?
Yes. So there's so many reasons why it's important to be a good negotiator. I mean, contracts are involved in everything from your child's birthday party to school events to, anything that you do. Anything requires a contract in this day and age. Think about buying a house. And there's so many transferable skills when it comes to a venue contract and other types of contracts. There's a lot of legalese, as well as just building the muscle of negotiating and learning that dance. So it's one of those things where like, it can be very intimidating to people. In fact, when I was early in my career, I remember being very intimidated by things like attrition and these lengthy contracts that I would hear our clients talking about. And it actually motivated me to become an expert in contract negotiations because I never like feeling like I don't understand something. And so when an opportunity arose to take on this hybrid role where I was operating events half the time. And then the other half the time, I was a purchasing and procurement manager under our VP of procurement at this agency I was at before I joined Google, where I spent 10 years. And she was just so amazing. I mean, this is why it's also so important, Megan, I know we talked about this, to have a mentor, is she really took me under her wing and explained the why behind every single clause. And it was so invaluable. So I've taken that skill set with me now. I took it to Google and, would teach trainings on contract negotiations at Google. And then I took it with me to Amazon and took it to Vision Fund. And it's something that I will still refer to my own cheat sheets, just to refresh myself every time I'm looking at a contract. But once you have that confidence, going into contract negotiations becomes really fun, and it becomes just a great tool that you have in your toolkit. And it also just helps whoever you're negotiating with take you more seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had a similar experience when I first moved into being a sales assistant. When I worked at Four Seasons, my assistant director of sales, who I directly supported, that was one of the first things she did. It wasn't really necessarily part of my job, so to speak, to redline agreements for her. I mean, technically it fell under her, but she was, I think, wise enough to know, hey, this can save me a ton of time if I can teach my assistant how to read and understand an agreement. So when initial red lines come back in, I could go through and easily approve or deny certain things. And then it got to the point where I got so comfortable with it that she was letting me just go ahead and redline agreements that were coming in. And she did the same thing, walked through every single term. And this is what is reasonable. This isn't what is reasonable. This is why we can do it versus why we can't, because it would cost us this much money, or, whatever. And that's been so beneficial for me moving forward, from moving into that position to then moving into a recruiting role, because we do a lot of contracts in recruiting. And then even from there, moving into starting this company, because when you start a business, you're signing a lot of contracts, and contracts and a lot of language is very similar from contract to contract. There's certain nuances, depending on if you're booking something in a hotel versus, signing a legal document to start a business, but there is some stuff that is the same. And so, well, I'm curious to know from you, because I think the first sort of chapter or subchapter of this contract negotiation part of your course is about contract negotiation 101. So can you give us a few examples of what people can expect who are just starting to get into the contract negotiation process that everybody should be aware of?
Yes, definitely. I think the most important thing to convey is that most new planners don't necessarily know why they should be assertive when approaching contract negotiations. And I'm here to give you permission to be offensive, to be assertive. The truth is just like, I think a lot of people are familiar with buying and selling homes. We watch shows like $1 Million Listing, and we, a lot more public facing. There's always a negotiation, right? And so hotels and venues expect it. Here's a big secret. They don't put in half the terms that they could put in, because why would they if they don't have to? It's not favorable to them. So, but most of the time, if you ask for them, they are either obligated to, and we'll go into some of these clauses later in our session, or they will work with you and at least meet you halfway. So it's just like when you're going into any kind of negotiation, it's a dance, it's a back and forth. There's a counter and you counter, they counter, different legal departments review. So, and it's actually advantageous to go in with, a lot of requests and a lot of red lines. It will help you be taken more seriously, not just at the beginning of the contracting process, but throughout your program. They will see you as more strategic, more senior. If you send 0 red lines back, they're going to know that they can probably take advantage of you. I hate to say that, but every step of the way in the process. So just be mindful of that, that it's totally normal and expected to go back with requests. And so my goal in this session is to help give you the tools that you need from both a legal perspective and also just from a non-legal perspective, like how to save the most budget and get the most concessions so that you're not only going to avoid unwanted surprises and protect your company and yourself, but you're also just going to end up with a way better contract that saves you a ton of money.
And a way better event.
Yeah, exactly. Your attendees are going to be happier too.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some of those clauses that are absolute have to haves that aren't always necessarily included in it? Because like you said, we definitely have on the hotel side some more bare bones agreements and expect people to add certain clauses in. So from your perspective, what are the ones you always add in?
Okay, sit back and relax because I've got some meat for you here. So number one clause is rebook clause. Hotels will not put this clause in. They just, why would they? But if you ask for it, they most often will. And I will tell you, my most recent contract that I negotiated, I asked for it 5 times and they declined it 5 times. And I just kept asking and they finally said, okay. So it's also okay to just keep asking. At a certain point, you might not be able to get certain clauses, but oftentimes if you're persistent, they want to get that contract signed, they will bend. Yeah. So rebooking is super important, especially in today's world with these never-ending situations and pivots that we're going through. It's always better to have some flexibility built into your contract. So what rebooking means is that you're able to rebook the event. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can be more savvy when it comes to rebooking. So be mindful of how your rebooking clause looks. So for instance, typically a rebooking clause will give you a percentage of deposits paid or owed to rebook a program within a certain period of time. So first of all, go in and ask for 100%. They won't always give you 100% rebooking, but most of the time they will, or at least give you 75%. So that's number one, is get very clear on how much of your penalties they will allow you to use in rebooking or sunk costs, whatever you want to call it. Number two, that's really important, is the length of time. So I've seen people make the mistake of, oh, yay, I got a rebooking clause. But guess what? The timer started when they signed the contract. And you really want it to start at the program date, because if you're planning, 6 months might go by and then you only have 6 months left to rebook, and that may not work for you. So that's, 12 months is pretty standard and fair in my opinion. And hotels will typically honor 12 months from the program date rebooking. Right. And then another super important call out is to try to make that rebooking as flexible as possible. So sometimes hotels will try to slip in a clause that says, you can rebook, but it has to be the exact same event size and program. And that's not super flexible, because you might end up, moving locations for the event, but wanting to use that for a few smaller events over a period of time. To give you an example, one time I was planning an event in India that canceled, and I had room blocks at several hotels. And I knew that I was never going to reschedule that event in India for reasons I won't get into. But I really wanted to figure out how I was going to use this rebooking policy and all this money that we had invested in these hotels. And so I had the idea to ask the hotel if we could apply our cancellation deposits towards just hotel rooms for employees to stay when they were visiting India for business throughout the year. And we actually ended up getting that approved. So we saved the company all this T&E budget, and it wasn't necessarily used for an event.
So great. It's so smart.
Yeah. So that's, there's a lot of nuance when it comes to these terms. So it's not just knowing what term to ask for, but also knowing the different nuances. So rebook is huge. Your company will love you for getting a very solid rebook in. Force majeure is another clause of the year, clause of, the last 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
Yeah. And one thing to bring up is that a lot of hotels will no longer entertain language surrounding COVID because the pandemic is no longer considered an unforeseeable circumstance. Everybody foresees COVID being around for, at least the next few years. So, but you can add in things like, for example, if a government mandates either in the destination city or the origin city where your attendees are traveling from, that would prevent XX% of attendees from physically traveling to your event, then that's considered force majeure.
Right.
So you can get nuanced with that too for COVID.
Or the amount of people in a specific room changes, like spacing requirements and like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's actually a perfect segue to this term that people are not always familiar with called frustration of purpose. And it's not necessarily its own clause, but that can really strengthen your argument about proving force majeure. So if you clearly state the intent of your meeting in your contract, which people often will not do. But for instance, if you specify exactly how many people need to be at the event for, each function of the event, so this many people for meals and this setup, blah, 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 blah. And then you can prove that your purpose is not able to be fulfilled. That will strengthen your legal case that force majeure can escalate. So just to give you an example of this, I had a hotel buyout for an event in 2020, right when the pandemic hit. And the event was in September 2020, when there were still a lot of policies in place in California, where, for example, events over 100 people, you still had to social distance. And so luckily, since I had specified, what we needed to accomplish at the event in my contract, I was able to work with my production agency to diagram out how many people could actually fit in the venue with these 6 feet social distancing measures in place. And because we couldn't even get 200 people in, and the contract stated we needed the venue for 500 people, we were off the hook for $2 million.
Amazing.
So company loved me. Legal team loved me. So this is how you can become a hero for your company, just by knowing a few savvy things to include. And then just a few other things that I would throw in are like a renovation clause or a construction clause. This can be very, very disruptive to your event if you do not know that a hotel is going through construction, either in advance of your event or during your event, most importantly. So you can actually ask a hotel to disclose any construction taking place. And I was in a situation once where a hotel had to report monthly to me how the construction was coming along to make sure that it was not going to impede on my event. And then another funny story to bring up is it's worth it to also ask about construction happening in any neighboring buildings. I found myself in a situation once where I was in a keynote at the W Hotel downtown San Francisco when suddenly a wrecking ball started destroying the building next to the W. And you can imagine that was not ideal from a noise perspective. And I thought on my feet and ended up buying the construction crew a 5-course Michelin star lunch so that they would take a break for like the next 3 hours.
Nice.
So
that's a good way to delay them.
That worked out, but so that's something that I now think to ask for as well. So,
and I think it's smart too with construction. And if you're doing a quick event turnaround booking within the same year, normally hotels know there's going to be construction. But I've seen, on my side, on the hotel side, we had people who are booking out and locking in rooms and rates 5 years in advance. And typically speaking, on a hotel renovation timeline, you're going to want to do a soft renovation every 5 to 7 years and probably a hard renovation upwards of every 10 years. And they don't necessarily have those dates set in stone. So if you're booking far in advance, you definitely want to have that clause in there. because when they do start to set those renovation schedules, one of the first things they do on the sales side is pull up all the contracts and look at when those dates are, and then they plan their renovation schedule around big meetings.
Right. Or if you have that clause in there and then they do have construction that could potentially interfere with your event, you have the benefit of being able to get out of that contract.
Right.
Without penalty.
Yeah.
So very good point. The last one I would throw in there is just a competitor clause. This is really important if you're planning an event with lots of confidential information. Hotels are very good about honoring this. So you can state typically 3 to 5 competitors and tell the hotel, like, you cannot sell space to any of these competitors if there's available space at that hotel over your dates, because you would not want to be in that situation. So that's another good one to get in.
Yeah, I think all of those are fantastic. So are there any extra clauses that you like to throw in as bonus clauses that aren't necessarily have to have, but things that you've seen make a big impact either on, the finances of your budget, or just things that are nice, like wow moments for your guests?
Yeah, definitely. I think one that people don't really think about, and it's definitely not imperative, it's not something I would fight tooth and nail for, but you can ask about staff ratios. That it's pretty self-explanatory, but right now, as we're seeing hotels in the hospitality industry as a whole struggling to get back to fully staffing their departments, it can be important to just understand what the staffing ratios are. And if they can't staff appropriately, you can potentially get some kind of compensation agreed upon ahead of time. And you can get that in writing up front. And then I like, again, to use that house purchasing analogy again, I always go in asking for a list of amenities to be included. And I don't expect to get them all, just like you might go into a house negotiation and ask for a number of things, for the seller to take care of before you buy the house. But some of those things that I will request are things like free site visit rooms for my team and my agency. Those can add up, and oftentimes the hotel will comp them if you get it in writing. Welcome amenities for your executives or VIPs, free upgrades to suites at the group rate for VIPs. I like to get like a 1 per 40 room comped. Hotels will often do that, so you can get some cash back at the end for your room block. Things you might not think about, like free furniture removal if you're planning on moving out furniture and bringing in your own. Same thing with like free package storage. Ground transfers to and from the airport can be comped sometimes by the hotel. Same thing with like comping valet parking. Sometimes they'll do that. I've gone so far as to ask for like complimentary breakfast or like a complimentary reception, or like just give me free coffee for the whole event. Like that can save you thousands of dollars. And then a big one that I am pretty insistent upon, and I will fight tooth and nail for this one, is waiving any meeting room fee. And I will go in and say, hey, give me a higher food and beverage minimum, but I do not want to pay meeting room rental. And typically hotels have 3 big ways that they make their revenue on a contract. It's the meeting rental, the room block, and food and beverage. And then just having your group in house, you'll end up with private room folios that people are billing as well.
Right.
That you're not on the hook for. But if they can make up the revenue for that meeting rental in another way, they're often willing to flex. So sometimes they'll say, hey, give me more suites. I want more suites, and I'll pay more for the suites if you'll waive my meeting room fee, or give me a bigger food and beverage minimum. I'd much rather spend the money that I'm spending on really awesome food and beverage, upgraded wines, top shelf liquor for my attendees, because they'll actually see that. They're not going to see any benefit in me paying a meeting rental fee.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I think you make a really good point. And going back to like the first one you said, which is free site visit rooms, especially free site visit rooms, because I used to do the site visits at my last hotel. it's so important because when the initial, RFPs come in and we do a, meeting space block and a room block, so much can change as it comes closer to the actual event. And once you physically go there and you see the way that the space is laid out, then you're going to realize pretty quickly, like, okay, what we originally had intended for this meeting space isn't going to work. And that, like, you may need to set up and do more site visits then, right? So if you can lock that in, that you have those free site visits, you're going to save quite a bit of money there too. I love the idea about, welcome amenities. I think that's super important. And most hotels will do, beautiful custom amenities with your logos on them, which is a really nice touch, and it makes people feel super welcome. And then another thing too, and I think it depends, because I mostly worked in resort properties. So most of the clients who came to our property were usually for like president's clubs or some type of, like reward stay. But I think you would also, I think we're going to talk about this in a little bit when it comes to attrition and having pre and post rates. I think 3 days pre, 3 days post.
Yeah,
is
that's
really
a great one.
It's a really great one, especially if you're at a resort property, because people want to bring their families and the kids can go swim at the pool and their spouses can go, golf or, do some type of fun activity. And then you're making that up in attrition, which I know I'll talk about in a little bit. But I think all those are really, really good. And you mentioned valet parking, but also free self-parking. Because valet is a little bit more difficult. For some companies, because a lot of hotels will do a third-party vendor.
Exactly.
And so they won't negotiate that as much because it's not a cost that they can adjust themselves. But if they have parking on site, it's usually like maybe $5 or $10 less than valet parking, but it costs them nothing. It's literally, they give you a barcode, you get in. It's something that you can do and it doesn't cost them anything. So if it is a property somewhat nearby where a lot of the people live that are attending that they can drive to, that's a really nice benefit. And I would also say like resort fees.
Yes.
That's another one, because a lot of times hotels will like add that extra $30 or $40 per night. That includes Wi-Fi and I don't know, coffee and tea or whatever it is. And that's a really easy thing for them to waive too.
Yeah, it's so funny that you bring that up. Those are all great. So getting that group rate 3 days pre-post is excellent advice. I always add that to my contracts, and hotels are very amenable to that.
Yep.
In terms of the
resort fees.
Yeah, thank you. Brain fart. The resort fees. This was one that I used to get comped on the regular. And I am seeing so much pushback on this now.
Oh, really?
Yes. And I'm seeing this across the industry. My peers are actually, lamenting about this as well. We're not only seeing that hotels will not waive these fees lately, but they're also tacking on a lot more fees, kind of similar to what airlines are doing right now. It's almost like the hospitality industry is trying to make up for the past 2 years where COVID really had an impact by like going overboard now. So I'm seeing things like admin fees, like setup fees, health fees, like event planning fees, like all these crazy fees are being tacked on. And like, I'm having a really hard time with hotels comping them.
Yeah.
So it's interesting where some of these things, again, that's why I go in asking for everything. Never feel bad asking for the world, because at different times, hotels are willing to comp different things, and you never necessarily know why it is, but you might as well go in big because they're less likely to add stuff if you go back for a second ask.
Yeah. Now, this is an interesting, one person just asked us in the Q&A, which I have my opinion on it, but I would be curious to hear yours too. She said that they had booked a presidential suite for their president of the company to check in, but because the presidential suite had been booked by a leisure guest and they had it guaranteed, I think 4 p.m. late checkout, which for those of you who don't know, it's so certain, I think it's American Express and then certain travel agencies that are on the leisure side guarantee late checkouts for rooms in certain types of hotel. I think Marriott does it, Four Seasons does it, like a handful of different organizations. So they had to wait till 5 p.m. so that the room could get turned before their president could check in to that suite. So she said, is this something that can be put in the clause? So I can tell you my thoughts, but
Yeah, I will tell you my thoughts. One, I
Mhm.
always book when I have executives coming on site, I always book the room the day before.
That was my answer. Yep.
Yeah, because I
Yep.
want to make sure it is ready by the morning. I just don't trust that it will be ready by the time my exec gets on site. Plus, I want to go do a walk of the room.
Mhm.
That's something that's important too, is like go walk the room. You would be surprised at the things you find in these suites. I won't go into it here, but do a sweep of the room, sometimes even do a security sweep with your security
Yeah.
team if you have VAPs. It might cost you a little extra money, but for my peace of mind, I prefer it, because that's another thing that's really hard to get hotels to budge on, is that, the check-in time. You can ask for early check-in, but they won't guarantee it.
Right. And you get a little bit more wiggle room. Again, a lot has changed in the past 2 years because of the pandemic. But when we would have full buyouts, because we were locking in, especially far in advance, a lot of revenue for the hotel is guaranteed. We would, like I said, for VIP rooms, put in a hold the day before for that exact reason, so that they can do a deep clean, walk through, make sure amenities were set. But then also we would put holds on the meeting space for our VVIP conference clients. And that's really nice too, because then you can get into your space a day early or like the night before for load in. So those are things you can negotiate right in the beginning of the contract process. That is very doable.
Yeah, let's double click on that meeting space point that you just brought up. That is something that is very important to look at in contracts, and oftentimes meeting planners won't. Is first of all, have the hotel clearly specify what meeting space you're getting. So the rooms and everything, and get a clause in that they will not switch that space on you. Because sometimes what will happen is a better group will come in, that spend more money, and they'll switch your space for less optimal space.
Right.
So, but if you get a clause in when you sign the contract that says you cannot move our meeting space without our permission, then they have to, stick to that. B is they won't always do this. They should do this, but make sure that they specify exactly when you have your meeting room space. Because sometimes what will happen is they'll say you have it from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And you don't realize, oh, wait, I actually need to get in at 6 a.m. to like prepare everything. And in my case, like I often need a 24-hour hold on the rooms. So I always ask for 24-hour holds for each day. And that's just something you want to get very, very, very clear on, is like what time you get access to the room. Is it hard keyed? You want it hard keyed so that you don't have to worry about security, or if you don't, if you have a lot of expensive security equipment, you might want to spend extra money on security. And then the other thing that you want to think about is loadout. How long is it going to take you to get out of the space, and how long do you have to get out of the space? Because that's super important too, and you can negotiate that as well. So that's a really great point.
Another question that came in that talked about staffing ratios that you had talked about for a potential negotiable. She said, what would be considered a good ratio, or what would you request in the contract copy? And then the second piece of that, she said, what type of compensation would you try to get for not meeting that ratio?
Ooh, that's a great question. So this is one of those things where there's no one answer, because there's so many variables. So just to give you an example, when you're thinking of staff ratios, like it's going to be very different in a property where you're in a stacked hotel and one staff can easily service a few rooms quickly. Whereas if you're on a resort and it's very spread out, and like rooms are bigger and take longer to get to and to clean, you might need more staff. So it really depends on the property. But typically, like if you have a 1 staff to 1 or 2 guests, that's a really solid ratio. You're going to have great service. 1 staff to 4 or more is like starting to get less good. Anything above that, I would start asking for compensation. And when it comes to that, I think it's really trying to figure out, what would that cost be to bring in additional staff and then getting some compensation for that. But Megan, I don't know from being on the hotel side, if you have more insight into that, because you may have better insight than I do.
Yeah, it's interesting because again, I only ever worked in luxury properties. And so that wasn't something that ever came up because I think it's implied with like Four Seasons and Ritz-Carlton that we have a high staff to guest ratio. So these other things that we talked about, and one other thing I was just thinking about is that you can request if you want more of a VIP experience, is we would do VIP check-ins for your VIPs where we'd actually meet them on the front drive and walk them directly up to the room and surpass the front desk check-in. So that's something else that you can request. And or if it's a really large group of people checking in, like it's just, you kind of lose the experience when everybody's standing at the front desk in a line waiting to check in and put their card down for incidentals. So we had a few different times where we had a separate satellite check-in, and I think we did that for free. That was negotiated so that people didn't have to wait at the front desk with random, leisure guests. They had one that was like in a beautiful area in the conference center that had a separate entrance that, when they pulled up in their vans, they were just ushered right in. So that's another thing that potentially could be negotiated.
Totally. I agree. Like luxury hotels, especially, so you have a lot more leverage. That brings up another good point. If you buy out a property, you have a lot more leverage. Like hotels love buyouts and they will treat you like a VIP. So you can, you typically get a lot more flex if you're buying out the property.
Yeah.
So things like, pre-keying all of our VIPs and meeting them, are going to be hotels are going to be a lot more amenable to that because they have no other guests that they're dealing with in-house. And so they want your program to succeed. They're putting all their focus on your program.
Yeah.
So,
and the other thing too, and there's another question I'll touch on in just a second is, and I think I read this in your article and it reminded me about the importance of relationships in this business. Are so key because when you're on the hotel side and you have a really great group that comes in and they're awesome, you're much more amenable to give them good concessions the next time around because you want them to come back. If they're a nightmare group, and I have seen some nightmare groups, you are like, they're never coming back again. Or if they do want to come back, we're going to make it really, really difficult and charge them.
It's so true. And actually you bring up a good point, which is it all starts with your first interaction, which is the hotel contract negotiating. Yeah. And so I always try, while I stated that it's important to be assertive, it's also helpful when you understand the hotel's point of view. I used to sit on the Ritz-Carlton Tech Advisory Board. And it was awesome because I would get to go to these advisory board meetings where they would really kind of show us behind the curtain, like, this is what it's like from the hotel side. Like, this is what we're dealing with. And it was just so helpful to understand, okay, this is what the hotel needs. So then when you're going into these negotiations, you can position it differently. So it's like, look, I know I'm not trying to take revenue away from you. I totally get it that you need to make your revenue in these ways, but could you flex in this way so that we're both happy? And so if you approach it as like a partnership and how can we, compromise here, it typically is a really good way to start the relationship and then you both win.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question that came in, it says, any tips for negotiating some of these items when you're booking around a large conference and most hotels in the city are booked? I feel like I have no leverage even with repeat bookings over the years and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars.
So I'm not sure specifically what you mean by that. I think sometimes it can be advantageous when you're booking around a bigger event because, for instance, I recently booked at a hotel where most of the hotel rooms were taken up for a big industry-wide conference. And so I didn't have a hotel room block requirement and I got all this meeting space, which was kind of awesome. It saved me like $200K for the hotel contract. So there are ways it can be advantageous. I guess I just want to clarify specifically what pain points you're trying to avoid and get around.
whoever put that, if you want to add some extra color with what exactly you're having a challenge with, because you made a really good point. If it's at a conference like the Orlando County Convention Center, right? It's like I think that and Chicago have the two largest conference centers in the United States. Rooms in Orlando can get booked up very quickly. And so room blocks can be hard. But then if you want to have a side event outside of the conference, meeting space is probably going to be a little bit easier to negotiate because those spaces aren't going to be used up, right? Like room block is, meeting space isn't. Now, vice versa, if there's a lot of meetings happening, but there's not a lot of rooms being used because maybe meetings are being used by local businesses and people are just driving in every day, then you might have a little bit more to negotiate on the room side because they're desperate to fill their room block as opposed to their meeting spaces all booked up by local businesses. So I think it really just depends on kind of what it is that you're requiring.
Yeah. And one thing that I experienced recently too, that's worth bringing up here, I don't know if this will help answer the question or not, but sometimes you might think that you know, there are hotels that are just out of your budget range. You don't even try them. And you might be surprised that some of these higher end hotels might actually be more cost effective. So it's worth it to expand your net if you find you're having issues with the hotels that you're trying to book at. Sometimes those bigger hotels like require way bigger room blocks, or they don't have the optimal space, where some of these smaller hotels might not get as many groups during the week. They get a lot more weddings on the weekends, for instance. I'm just throwing that out there. Yeah. And so you might actually find that they have a less meeting room, less hotel block requirement, or their meeting space is a lot less expensive. Like I had this experience recently where the Four Seasons in San Francisco was coming in less expensive than, a much lower quality hotel. And that completely blew me away. Mm-hmm. But it was because it was during like one of these citywide programs where they didn't want to use these high-end hotels. It didn't have big enough space. So sometimes it's the timing too. Yeah. And just kind of like being creative, thinking outside the box and not ruling things out. Because sometimes, to Megan's point, like you don't know when something's gonna have what you need available and for the price that you need.
Yeah. So she did add, to clarify, the whole city is booked out. Meeting rooms are $5,000 to $10,000 per day plus large food and beverage minimums. We book a year in advance and seem to have no wiggle room on the price. If we don't book, they're happy to let us go, it seems.
So I would either look at different dates for your program if you're seeing this consistently, or look at different venues.
Yeah.
Can you
or different cities, unless you're there specifically for a conference, that you have to go to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, if you're finding consistently that hotels are not needing to accommodate you, then I would either explore a non-hotel venue. Mm-hmm. There's lots of companies like a Peer Space where you can find really cool bespoke venues to use. Yeah. Oftentimes like restaurants will even have really good space. There's like corporate like you can go on Airbnb and book hotel rooms. There's so many different ways to, like I've used when I've done events, for instance, at like the Democratic and Republican national conventions, hotel rooms book up years in advance and you cannot find them. And so I actually researched like months in advance Airbnbs and just booked up a ton of Airbnbs for our staff. And like, it was great. So sometimes you just have to get creative if you have no other alternative. Like you have to be in that city because it's a convention. That's where the convention is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not ideal, but you can just get creative.
Yeah. It's like JP Morgan in San Francisco. That makes it much more difficult. So we mentioned this a little bit before, but what are some requests that you think it will be hard to get wiggle room on? Not necessarily because of buyouts, but I did see she goes, I was talking about JP Morgan in San Francisco. Okay. So now we know, Michelle, there's not a whole lot of wiggle room for JPM. So one person, Nicole, had mentioned like bringing your own AV partner because that's a big cost savings. And I agree with that. A lot of times hotels, and I mentioned this before about Valet, certain hotels always have a third party and there's not really wiggle room you can use in price there. So audiovisuals one, Valet is one, certain like actual design and materials that the hotels use for decoration, they'll use from third parties. Anything else you've seen that hotels typically just won't budge on?
Yeah, so AV, let's touch on AV because AV is a funny one. Oftentimes hotels will partner with an in-house AV provider like an Encore PSAV company, and they're not usually great, to be honest. And they charge a lot, and it's the convenience factor is like you just book direct through the hotel, they handle it. If you need something last minute on site, they can usually provide it because they're on site. So it's really you're paying for the convenience factor. But knowing that they're more expensive, I will try to negotiate a couple of things. One, I'll try to negotiate like 10 to 20% off. Sometimes they will give you that because they know they're overpriced and they know that, you know, it's a convenience factor and they still want the business. And again, it depends on like how busy they are. Like there's other factors involved. Like if they really need the business, they'll flex. But if it's a third party, it's not always under the hotel's control.
Right.
Another thing sometimes that happens is they will charge you a corkage fee. So they'll say, yeah, you can bring in your own vendor that's less expensive, but you have to pay $5,000 if you use another vendor. You have to pay us $5,000. Like that just happened to me recently in a contract, and I still am bringing in my other vendor, but you have to pay the corkage.
Right.
Sometimes that, like I've had that happen with food and beverage as well. Sometimes I want some specialty food and beverage. And I always ask if a hotel can source it for me, and they might charge you a markup, but if you have a very high food and beverage minimum,
why not?
Money that you need to spend, like go for it. That's happening to me right now. And I'm doing these little micro kitchens where we have these snack kitchens, and I wanted all these really fun snacks. And rather than sourcing them myself, since I have such a high food and beverage minimum, because I got my meeting fees waived, they actually agreed to source all of it for me, which is great because now it's just rolling into my food and beverage minimum. Plus, I don't have to deal with ordering it and paying for shipping. So, and then with
packing and unpacking and all of that.
So just, you know, again, it like comes to being creative and just, you know, you might as well ask, and it's not always consistent from property to property. So you might as well ask. And then parking, that's another one where, to your point earlier, it's sometimes and often is handled, like valet parking is handled by a third party. So sometimes hotels will want to waive things and they just can't because it's not their, you know, their vendor to manage. But sometimes they will be creative and like, you know, negotiate on the self-parking or like offer to give you free shuttle transportation that they can provide. Or free use of their in-house vehicles. So, you know, it also really depends on like what the macroeconomic environment is like at the time and what's happening at the same time of your program. So there's these like outside factors that will also influence how flexible a hotel can be.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's out of your control.
I want to double click on valet parking, and we talked about it, but because I used to oversee like front desk, concierge, bell, door, and valet, I think people don't quite understand because I used to get people who get so upset all the time about the cost of valet parking. There's a reason why, and it's because they are a third party vendor, and the reason why hotels do third party vendors is there's a massive amount of liability when it comes to valet parking and parking cars, and the amount of insurance that you have to maintain for it is something that's so astronomical. It's actually less expensive for a hotel to outsource it than it is for the hotel to assume that liability. So be kind to the front desk agents and the valet people. Like they're not the ones setting the price. It's the company and it's the insurance that they're having to pay for. That's really like the reason why it's so expensive.
Totally.
Okay, so let's, 'cause we're getting close on time. Oh my gosh, this has just flown by. Let's talk about attrition for a second. And can you kind of outline a little bit about attrition, what it is, and some creative ways you've gotten around it?
Yes. So attrition is just for those of you who aren't clear on the definition. It's really when you contract a room block with a favorable rate, you're getting guaranteed that special group rate and availability. The hotel's holding a number of rooms for you at a special rate. But you also have to put in place specific restrictions. The hotel has to put in place some restrictions that protect itself financially, which makes perfect sense, right? So an attrition clause is added to every contract. They're in every single one if you have a room block. And it's basically what percentage of that room block that you have contracted are you required to fill by your group? Otherwise, you have to pay for unused rooms minus the allowable attrition. Okay, so to give you an example, and this is super basic, easy math because I hated calculus.
Yeah.
If you have a hotel block of 100 rooms and you have a clause that allows up to 80% attrition, you need to book at least 80 rooms with your group. And if you don't, you pay for the unused rooms. And then what also happens is if you have all those perks that we talked about, all those amenities, sometimes hotels will say, you only get all these great amenities if you hit your room block. So that's why you want to hit, your allowable attrition amount. So when you're negotiating a contract, how to go about attrition. First, you want to be really strategic in determining your room block commitment. And this can be really challenging because you basically want to estimate how many rooms you think you're going to need so that you'll have enough for your group, but not too many that you're paying for unused rooms and not, getting your amenities because you're not hitting your block. So once you determine what kind of room block you're, comfortable committing to, then you try to get the best attrition rate. So I think the best attrition rate I've, gotten of late is 70% allowable attrition.
That's really good.
And which is good, and then negotiate up from there. So I usually start with 70 and then oftentimes I'll get met like halfway. Sometimes you get met with less. Again, it all comes down to that supply and demand and other conditions that are happening. But I like to start with 70. And then there's all these nuances like Meagan referenced earlier. So one thing that's super important to ask for, you will not always get it, unfortunately, but definitely ask for it, is cumulative attrition. So what that means is hotels, typically, if you don't ask for cumulative attrition, they will charge you attrition based on each night. So if you have like 3 nights in your contract and you don't hit your attrition one night, but you overcompensate the next night, if you have cumulative attrition, it could balance out so you're in the clear. But if it's on a per night basis, if you don't hit your numbers for a specific night that's less popular, you pay attrition on that night, whether or not you made up for it with pre and post event dates, with higher averages on the other nights. So that's something that's like a little bit nuanced. And then the other thing is a resell clause. This is another one that hotels won't necessarily put in, but will often, but pretty much always put it in if you ask for it because they're liable to add it. So what a resale clause means is if a hotel is able to resell the rooms that you would have had to pay attrition for, you should not be on the hook for them. Why? Because legally they shouldn't be able to make up double the income. They shouldn't be able to get your attrition because you didn't fill the room and resell it. Then they're getting paid double and you're being penalized for no reason. So how do you prove that they were able to resell it? You ask for an in-house report each night so that you know how many total rooms were sold. If you see that the hotel was sold out, you should not be charged attrition, right? Because it means that they were able to resell your rooms. And then another strategic thing is, think about if, as you're getting closer to your event, or even if you're further out and you feel like, ooh, I overestimated how many rooms I was going to need for this program. I'm not going to have as many attendees as I thought I was going to have. you can ask your hotel, you can say, hey, I'm going to give back some rooms. Can you try to resell them? So like I did that recently. I said, oh, I actually don't need these, Monday, Tuesday rooms. I'm going to give them back to you now because now you have 4 months to try to resell them.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that you can use as leverage as well.
No.
And then, I think that's kind of, that's the bulk of the attrition. Any other questions on attrition?
I don't think so. So then I think the last thing, since we're coming up on our last few minutes, is what are just some other sort of highlights or extra factors that you think people should consider when they are going to be negotiating a contract, either for the first time or maybe this is a repeat event that they're going to be doing again? What are some major factors to consider?
So if you're doing a repeat event, use your data, go into your previous bills from your last event and use that data. See, what was I actually charged for? Were there unexpected costs that I didn't think I was going to be charged, like extra staffing fees, for extra bartenders that we needed, or furniture removal that we weren't expecting, or, who knows what it is that was added in. Maybe you ended up having to order a ton more coffee on site and it added thousands of dollars to your contract. Okay, well, now going into it. The other thing is, like, speaking of food and beverage minimums, a couple of points here. One is, how do you know that the food and beverage minimum the hotel is giving you is fair and reasonable? So I like to use like a Google spreadsheet in advance and kind of map out what I think my food and beverage spend is going to be. So I estimate, what functions I'm going to have. I will request the menus from the hotel just to make sure that I'm budgeting the right amount based on their menus. And then I can kind of compare, okay, what kind of food and beverage minimum are they giving me based on what I think I'm going to spend? Mm-hmm. So that's helpful too, as you go into negotiations. If they're charging you way more than seems reasonable, I would negotiate. And you can even show them your spreadsheet and say, hey, this looks way more than is reasonable. Yeah. And using data can be very advantageous.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, if you end up having to cancel an event, one thing that people don't often think of is food and beverage cancellation penalties. So if you cancel far enough in advance, the hotel is not having to order that food and beverage for your event. So they're not paying the hard cost of the food for your event. And so you should really only be charged the markup on the food and beverage, so the profit they would be making, not the sunk costs in the food and beverage. So that's something that you can negotiate with them too.
Yeah.
Those are just a few more little pro tips and tricks.
Yeah. And I would say for both first time events and repeat events, just as somebody who came from the hotel side. So if there's a brand and you love, but maybe you're going to a new city, see if they're going to be opening a new hotel in that area, because pre-opening sales teams are just very desperate to get stuff on the books. And so I remember when I was part of the pre-opening team at Four Seasons Orlando, there was one company that booked like 5 events for 5 years in a row, 5 years out, and the rates they were able to lock in, I know they're definitely not selling those rates anymore. I mean, they're probably 3-4 times the amount of what they are, now than what they were paying, but they locked those in for many years. And so if you're going to constantly be doing the same event year after year after year, that's a really great way to lock in great rates and food and beverage minimums.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Well, this was so wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Gianna. You're just such a gem. Everything you shared, I think, was really wonderful stuff that people can take away with them. And for anybody who is interested, this is literally what her entire course is like. It's just chock full of really useful information. It's also really beautifully done. And for all of you who joined us today, you're going to be getting an email from us and those who registered with a discount code so that you can purchase her course for 15% off. So keep an eye out for that email. Anything else you'd like to add before we go, Gianna?
No, I love hearing from everybody. You know, if you have any other questions, you can find me at giannagaudini.com. Pretty easy to find, and you can shoot me a message.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Megan.